And pregnant pause and grab the book. We are live. All right.
Okay.
Yeah. Well, good evening, everybody, and sorry for the fashionably late start here. My name is Patrick from the Poison Pen Bookstore in Scottsdale, Arizona, and we're really delighted to have our friend Mike Lawson here this afternoon or evening, discussing his brand new book, Redemption. And Mike was kind enough to sign a batch of books for us, although I must say we don't have too many left. There's a copy of it. And if you would like to order one, I will put a link in the comments field on Facebook and on YouTube. And if you have questions for Mike, go ahead and put them in, and Barbara will summon me back on screen towards the end of the hour. So Barbara, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to you.
Thank you very much, Patrick. Well, Mike, welcome. I'm drinking a little toast to you. I am not sure, but I don't recall that you and I have had an in-depth conversation over the course of your long career.
I don't believe we have, but I doubt you recall this because it happened so long ago. The first time I was at your store, this was probably 2006 or 7. Grove had sent me on a small tour when I think it was the third book came out. And I believe it was you. Someone from the store called and said, "Would you mind doing an event with Lisa Gardner?" And I said, "Well, of course not." And I showed up, and Lisa was there, and there was a big crowd there, to see her, of course, because I was hardly known. And the turnout was great, and we both gave our little talks. And at the end of it, 50 people line up to have Lisa sign their books, and I probably made what I'd call pity sales that night. There was 2 or 3 nice women that bought my book, and the thing I really remember about the event was Lisa's story, where I probably won't get the specifics right, but it sounded like she started writing when she was like 18 or 19 or 20 years old. That's all she ever did was write. The first book sounded like it was an instant bestseller, and I was thinking how that contrasted with my career of taking a long time to find the right agent and getting the book published. But anyway, that was I think the first time I was at your store. It was at that event, and I've always appreciated that.
Well, you're entirely welcome. Good for you. You have an excellent memory. We're coming up on year 33 in October, and I have to admit that I don't have complete recall of everything we've done. But anyway, since we haven't talked to Mike for a really long time, I did some background here, and let's talk a little bit about how he got started. And I can do that, provided, of course, I go back into, come on, I hate it when my email does this to me. But there we go. So you spent years in the Navy, and in particular, you were looking in nuclear engineering. And while you spent time in DC, which we'll talk about in a minute, you actually were in the Pacific Northwest around what, Seattle?
Yeah, then it's the town of Bremerton. There's a big naval shipyard there, and I spent my whole career working as a civilian, as an engineer, working in the Navy's nuclear power program. And most of that time was spent at this big shipyard in Bremerton. And then there was a few years back in Washington, D.C., where I was back at the Navy nuke headquarters back there. So, yeah, my whole career was spent doing that, working on reactors for the Navy.
Well, I'm sure your time in DC informs your Joe DeMarco series. But anyway, the question that Mike asked on his very good website is, how did I go from nuclear engineer to writing? And the short answer is, he says, I like to write. It's fun for me, and I tried it. That you need talent, persistence, and a lot of luck. But fortunately, in 2004, he got an agent and who liked The Inside Ring, which I'm assuming is your first novel, and got you a 2-book deal. And as of the last time you updated your website, anyway, you published 18 novels, 15 in your Joe DeMarco series, and 3 in your Kay Hamilton series. And now, with Redemption, we have a whole new thing. Although I'm not at all clear that it's going to turn into a series. I sort of had the feeling that this was a story that doesn't fit your Joe DeMarco series or anything else. And so you wrote it as a standalone. Would that be right?
That's exactly right. I mean, I like writing the DeMarco books. I enjoy them, and I have fun with the stories. But anybody that writes a series, there's just certain stories you can't tell. They just don't fit with the series. And so Redemption was just one of those stories I wanted to tell, and so I decided to write it. And the problem you have when you do that, and I kind of anticipated this, is that people are used to seeing one thing from an author, And then when you put something else out, it doesn't match that thing they're seeing. And I know with my own experience, I've always been a big Robert B. Parker fan. And in fact, Parker was one of those few guys at the time, I probably couldn't afford it. I'd buy the books in hardback as soon as they came out because I couldn't wait for the paperback. And he published a book that wasn't part of the Spencer series. And it wasn't that it was a bad book. It just wasn't what I expected. And I've noticed on the reviews for the book, which have been, 90% good, you still get that comment in there. Well, this wasn't DeMarco, or was as good as DeMarco, wasn't quite like DeMarco. And so that was the trepidation I had with the Standalone. And I hope to write more of them. I got one with back at my publisher right now. I'm waiting to hear back from them on that to see if they like it. But
well, this may encourage you, but actually you got my attention specifically because it was something different. I have a limited amount of time, and this month in June, I think there were well over 200 books I needed to review to look at, and April was terrible. And so I was attracted to Redemption because it wasn't a DeMarco. I could have just said normal things about a DeMarco, but I was really interested in the pitch for it. And one of the things that really fascinates me, because I too lived and worked in Washington, D.C. I was a librarian at the Library of Congress for a while. And I thank God every day I'm not there currently and haven't been there for some time. But you did say, I love the city because it's a target-rich environment for a writer. There's always something happening there, something corrupt, something outrageous, something heroic and dangerous that provides inspiration for fiction. But it also occurred to me that if I were you, what's going on in DC is so more than fiction that maybe it's a good time to take a break from writing about it. And maybe readers would just as soon take a break from reading about it, because every day in the paper is more bizarre than anything you could make up for Joe DeMarco.
Yeah, it definitely is. It gets so bizarre. There's nothing you can write as a fiction writer that can top some of the things going on. In almost everything, it seems like I write, even like in the current DeMarco book that I'm currently writing right now, it's almost hard to get away from the atmosphere and the poisonous environment. And I noticed that in the book I'm currently writing, wondering if I should somehow try to find some way to separate a little bit from that. But it's a book that unfortunately is actually set in DC because of the idea for that one. But
right. Well, you've looked at organizations like the CIA, the Pentagon, NASA, and so forth. And I think we all have fairly strong feelings about how those organizations are operating. So if you want to write a thriller that exposes corruption at its heart, or, insider spying or something, it's not really a thriller in the ordinary sense. It reads more like the Daily News. I like the idea that you have taken some elements of all that and moved them to Redemption, Illinois?
Yeah, which is a town I invented. I just wanted a setting of a small town near Chicago, and I just plucked that name out. But it was really just to create a small town environment and a decaying kind of town that you see kind of out in the Midwest a lot these days. And so it was, I didn't pick, particularly, Illinois or any other state, but it's just that setting of a small place that was close enough to a big city that in the book folks can go to Chicago or get away from there if they have to.
Well, I am from Chicago. Actually, I grew up in Winnetka, which is a northern suburb. And even then, 70 years, 80 years ago, there was a lot of corruption in Chicago, but the economy was still really booming. The steel mills were still going strong in Gary, the livestock industry, the railroad industry. My husband, as a Rosenwald and Susan Roebuck, which his great grandfather founded, was going strong. And it's not the Rust Belt in the sense that other places are, but the Midwest definitely, with new jobs, a new location, the tech centers have moved to the coast, the whole bit. That business, what used to be like the Midwest heart of American business isn't the same anymore. I suspect those feelings overtook people in New England, which was so prominent in the 18th and 19th century. Well, we had plantation economy in one part of the country, and then we had industrialization in another part of the country, but then it moved on. And, it's left New England with a huge problem about what to do with the old mill towns, what to do with the old buildings. Are there jobs for anybody? What can you do? And then the whole Rust Belt thing is there. So I thought it was very believable that you set up this town and the industry that's in it?
Well, the reason I remember two things. One was I was teaching at Muncie, Indiana for some kind of a writers conference. And I drove from Chicago to there. And I remember just as I was going, all I saw were cornfields and soybean fields. And you come to these little tiny towns and you can see the closed storefronts, and the only businesses left there were McDonald's or places like that. It's the same place in upstate New York. The Navy has a bunch of prototype reactor plants, and I'd go up there down in Schenectady up there. And that same thing, when you go through these towns, you can see them, the population was drifting away and the storefronts were closed and the factories were shut down, but the factory buildings were still there. And that's kind of what I was thinking of when I wrote Redemption. It was.
Yeah, no, it makes perfectly good sense. I mean, we're looking right now at, electric vehicles. We're looking at robots replacing people. We're looking at so many dislocations. And people who thought they had secure jobs in places don't necessarily. And unfortunately, it's not possible to retrain.
No. I would certainly hate to have to be retrained. It would be painful at my age.
Yeah. Well, my dad was in the telephone industry, and, he was all about, stringing lines and switchboards. And I mean, way back when, he was one of the people that put General Telephone together, and he would know what to do with cellular technology and, people giving up landlines and all the rest of it. I mean, that revolution has been extreme. So really? What is Drexler Industry? I like the name Drexler, although I thought briefly it was going to be a furniture company, but
I didn't think of that.
No, I did, but that you disabused me of that. So you're setting up a place called Drexler Industry. Then we can talk about how your guy gets there. But what plausibly would Drexler Industry be doing in a small town in Illinois?
Well, I mean, that was part of the point of setting in the small town. This is a book that's kind of hard to talk about without giving away too much of the plot. But what, and this comes out in the very first chapter of, what Drexler Industry, says they're doing is they're an institution that does financial research. And so the fact that it's set there is one of the things that makes the protagonist of the story kind of leery after a while. If you've got this business in this little town, and for some reason, the business is profitable, they're getting money from someplace. He's kind of wondering, well, how does it survive in a place like this? And it turns out in the end, of course, they don't do financial research. And I was actually using that Fusion GPS, the company that got all involved with the dossier and that sort of thing, is a similar company that does financial research. And in the case of that Steele dossier, that wasn't what they normally do. They do a lot of financial research, and that was, in a way, the model for Drexler, or what they say is the model for what their company does. Is they do research on financial institutions, and then this young guy, the protagonist of the book, he gets there, and that's after he's been fired from Wall Street, and told that's what he'd be doing, is this fairly mundane, kind of dull financial research for this little company. But in the back of his mind is, why is this company here as opposed to a financial center? And of course, it's there because of what they really do.
Right, which we don't want to talk about. But, it's interesting but what you're saying is that Drexler can plausibly perhaps survive in small town Illinois because it's not actually manufacturing anything. It's not making a physical product that, where supplies have to come in and people have to work and, work with it, then they have to ship out. So you have to have all that infrastructure and all. They're basically creating data for.
Yeah, I don't know if you noticed, but in the book, the Drexler's office or their building is set in a building that was, 1920s, used to make starter motors back in the old automotive days. And so, that industry's gone. And then because of this day and age, Drexler, that company can work, in that building because everything now is done by computers and by phone and by that sort of thing. And so, but it was exactly that, a building that no longer exists, but the structure's still there.
Well, absolutely. And stuff is being repurposed all over. Malls are being turned into condos or retirement homes, or we have a building in Scottsdale that was put up. It's called the Galleria. And I can't even remember what it was ostensibly supposed to be, but it was a boondoggle from start to finish. It didn't have parking. They created underground parking, and then that led to a major crime incident and people
Oh,
getting diverted off Scottsdale Road by the stakes. So they had to bag up that. And now it's being used, among other things, the immersive Van Gogh exhibit, shortly to be replaced, I think, by immersive Monet or Klimt, or that's a whole new gig going on, which is like an ATM. But nonetheless, there are buildings all over this country, malls all over this country, old mills in New England that are being repurposed for some more modern usage. So yeah, I did notice it. But again, that's perfectly plausible. I mean, when your guy, let's talk about your guy, because he's an interesting character. And his name is Jameson Maddox.
yes.
So tell us about Jameson. Who is he and what was he doing and what happened?
Well, with Jameson, the way he ends up in Redemption, Illinois, was he used to work on Wall Street, and he worked for, in the book, I have him working for Goldman Sachs. And then he goes and does something stupid and gets caught up in an insider trading thing. And he ends up being convicted, but he doesn't go to jail because he testifies against the 2 or 3 other guys that were involved with the insider trading problem. But that leaves him in a position where he's basically unemployable. Nobody in New York is going to hire him. He's got a felony on his record. And so he's finding a job. Then all of a sudden he gets an inquiry from this little company in Illinois. It doesn't appeal to him. And the idea of sitting there doing, research on financial for companies doesn't appeal to him, but it's a job. And he also wants to get out of New York a bit. And so that's how Jameson ended up there. He's got the skills to do something, much more complex than the jobs he's being asked to do. And then once he gets to the company, he finds out that the assignments are odd and he never knows who the clients are. He never knows what happens with the information. He gets asked to review things that are just extraneous to what he thinks the job would be. But that's how a guy like him ends up there, in that company, is because he screwed up in the past.
Yeah, well, this is how many legal thrillers start, is that you've got some high flying guy, most of the time somewhere in New York. And, they have a very expensive lifestyle. They usually have a very high maintenance wife or girlfriend. They're used to, the high life and, getting reservations on demand and all the rest of it. And then something goes wrong, whether he's in banking or law, but very often in law. And then the general design of those books is his life gets blown up and he's forced to do something that he would never have considered. And then in the process of doing that, somehow he finds redemption and very often some kind of a new calling. And I've read, I don't know how many legal thrillers that really function that way. Even if you go back to The Firm, which your book has been compared to, everybody loved the idea of a crooked law firm. Do you remember that The Firm, because I'm often asked to explain how some books hit the zeitgeist, why is it that a book can take off like the Da Vinci Code? And I remind people that when the Da Vinci Code published, the Pope was dying. And we first were hearing about sex problems in the Catholic Church. And so people were willing to believe in a corrupt church. With The Firm, it published right around the time that law firms were first allowed to advertise. And so the idea of a crooked law firm, which up till then, wouldn't have had much traction, suddenly had some.
Yeah.
And, so this isn't a crooked law firm thing. I mean, this is a guy who should have known better. Oftentimes, guys like this are pushed into making bad decisions because of the high maintenance people they're surrounded with or their own high maintenance. And so it leads them to do something they really know better. But they'll think, and also they've been protected by it all, so they think they'll just get away with it. And then reality hits, right? So, I mean, that part I've seen a lot before, but mostly they stay where they were. They stay in DC or they stay in New York and, all of that. But I love the idea that you took him to a place that is so totally foreign, small town Illinois.
Yeah, it was foreign to him, and he has, he's lost contacts with the people he used to be around, and he doesn't, have many friends in this place. And like I say, the job itself is not challenging. What becomes challenging is when he finds out what the company is actually doing. And
right.
And he
Well,
obviously,
I mean, you say he's being paid a paltry $120,000, and in New York, $120,000 is pretty paltry, but in Redemption, Illinois, that should make you fairly rich. I mean, there are people all over who'd love to make $120,000, but the scale is not really working for him. So he reluctantly takes the job. But the thing that happens here, which I think is also interesting, is that the guy that hires him, who thinks he's smarter than everyone in the whole world, forgets about how smart this guy actually is.
yeah, there's that. And then the woman that Jameson has an affair with is also brighter than the guy that hired him also. And
Right.
but I like Claude, the bad guy in the book, just because he's a survivor. He's been there a long time. He's tough. He's not terribly emotional, and but he's a worthy adversary, I think, for Jameson and the woman he has an affair with.
Well, I don't disagree with that. I mean, Jameson thinks he's too smart and too good to be there, and Claude has the other idea that because he screwed up, he can't be that smart. Therefore, he's a fairly safe hire for what he wants him to do. And they're both wrong. And then, of course, there's always the woman, who shows up and complicates it. And then we wind up with, killers and all kinds of fun stuff. And that's really all we can say without spoiling the plot. But I think your style I really like the way you write, Mike. And, did you have to work hard at developing a prose style, or is this sort of natural you have the voice?
I guess it's, in the first of all, when I was working for the Navy, I was an engineer, but I ended up doing a lot of writing. And I'd say the person that taught me to write was Admiral Hyman Rickover. I don't know if you know that name.
Absolutely, of course I do.
Well, I worked for him when I was back in DC, and he was an amazing person that he actually read. He had like 400 or 500 engineers working for him at that time back in DC, and he read everything you wrote. And your letter would go up to Rickover's office and it would come back scrawled all over the place because this was not clear enough. This wasn't succinct enough. And it was actually the start of learning how to write. And in the DeMarco series, it was a little bit easier in the fact that, Joe DeMarco is basically me. I'm writing, my thoughts and kind of the way I think and the way I react to a situation. So that made it easier than writing some characters like a Jameson or the protagonist in my Kay Hamilton series. Those are harder to write from that standpoint because I'm not writing about myself essentially like I do in the DeMarco books in terms of attitude and perspective and sense of humor and that sort of thing. So it is different that way.
Well, but there are two things involved. One of them is personality, i.e. voice, who is it? But the other thing is just like basic writing skills. And for example, I am continually pissed off because nobody sinks into a chair anymore. He sank into the chair. Nobody shone a flashlight, everybody, he shined the flashlight inside the cave, and I'm going, no, God damn it, he shone the flash, And I really feel like all around us, language to some degree is deteriorating. Part of it is, computer vocabulary and other stuff. And part of it is that people, once something like that gets started, that whole bit, with less calories versus fewer, once it gets out there, it's like people adopt it. And while language is supposed to evolve, I get that, I don't think that grammar has to completely fall apart. But I like the fact that you really know the basics of, grammar, punctuation, all that other stuff. And that enhances the voice. So they're two different things. One of them is personality, but one of them is just a command of basic style. So I'm assuming that you learned that, writing for Rickover and whatever.
Well, plus, I had a decent education. You learned English and you learned grammar. Then not to mention, I've got fantastic copy editors at Grove that find all the grammatical errors I make, and they do a great job of all that. I'm like you. I don't like when they get these styles sometimes where the author decides to, we won't use punctuation marks and we'll use little dashes instead of that. And I just find it off-putting, when I at the same time, there's still people out there that not only do they write, in what's comprehensible, but they have such flair. Like I'm reading books by an author I'd never read before, a guy named Mick Herron, who I hadn't read. I was down at a Left Coast of Crime convention in Albuquerque, and he was on a panel. I went and listened to him as I picked up his book, the Slow Horses.
Right.
And I love his writing style. I mean, it's not just it's the way he phrases things and the sense of humor and things like that. And so there still are writers out there that do that. And then there's other writers that are successful writers that they're like you're talking about, where the grammar's lacking and the sentence structure just seems weird to me. I mean, you can understand it, but like I said, it's off-putting to me when I read a book like that. I wouldn't mention any names, but it does bother me.
You'll be interested to know that John Sanford is a terrific Mick Herron fan. Whenever I get a new Mick Herron ARC, advanced reading copy, known in the publishing trade as ARC, A-R-C.
Right, yeah.
I send mine to John because he's such a super fan of Mick Herron. I've read him for years. And before he began to write the spy series, the Slough House,
yeah.
He wrote some other books that I thought were terrific that never really gained any traction. And it's interesting to me that he has done so well with a kind of modern John le Carré kind of thing. But if you went back, like I have, all the way back to his very early books, they weren't like that at all. And they were really wonderful. So, he's a very talented guy. It's interesting how, some authors are like, flash out of the gate and do really well. And
Right.
other authors like Mick really do a long, slow burn. I mean, he wrote a long time before he wrote Slow Horses, and now it's a TV series, and that has a huge effect. I always find that interesting, but I also think that the guys that do the long, slow burn, or the gals, part of it is based on the quality of their writing.
Well, I think a lot of it too is you have to enjoy writing, and I enjoy it. I mean, I don't know what I'd do if I didn't do this. And so, if one book doesn't work out, well, you write another book, and you send in a book. And even at this stage of my career, I'll send a book in, and they say, we don't think that's quite it. And so you write another book. And but you have to enjoy writing to do that. If it starts to become too much like work, you probably wouldn't do it.
I think that's a valid point, but you've come to writing after you had a very successful career and, presumably some sort of financial stability, just like I came to bookselling when I was 50, so I wasn't there. It makes it easier to do what you love if you don't also have to depend upon that to support your whole entire life.
Oh, yes. Yeah, it definitely makes it easy. I don't think I could do what I was doing, when I was working. It takes up too much time. And you wouldn't have this, the stability, certainly financially, by doing it that way. So I've been very lucky. I mean, I get a very good pension from the Navy, and now I do.
You can do it for fun, is what I'm saying, and it's not tragic if one book doesn't work out. That isn't going to put you on the street. And I think that means that, certainly for me too, that you can make decisions and take risks that you wouldn't do if you were supporting a family on it or something of that sort.
Yeah, that's true. If even like writing Redemption, I mean, the safe thing to do would be just write another DeMarco book and another one after that. But like I say, I enjoy writing DeMarco, but sometimes you just want to tell a different kind of story. And you're right. I've got I guess the luxury of being able to do that.
Well, you earned it. it wasn't given to you. You certainly earned it over the years. So you say you have some other ideas about standalones. Do you feel like they have to have a legal or political component, or
no?
Where would you be wandering off to in a new field?
Well, the one I'll give you a heads, I guess a heads up on this one. The one that's currently with my publisher. I don't know if he wants to publish it or not. I'm waiting to hear back on it. It has to do with one of my wife's friends. My wife's a nurse, and she had a bunch of her nursing friends over for a party at our place. And one of these nurses, she inherited a house from her mother. And the house is being rented by a woman, and the woman's son moves in. And this is during COVID. The mother dies, and now she has a squatter in her house. and she cannot get the squatter out of her house. I mean, the guy is and this is in real life. The guy is just absolutely crazy. And the only way she can eventually get rid of him is to actually sell the house. The only way she can get rid of this guy. But so the book I'm currently waiting to hear back on is based kind of on that story of a woman that is actually a couple of sisters have a squatter living in their house, and trying to figure out how to get this guy out of the house. And then, of course, it's got a little bit more complicated backstory as to what the squatter is really doing too. But so that's the next thing I'm kind of waiting to hear back to see if it'll be published or not. But so it has nothing to do with politics or it's crime fiction, but not in the sense of guns and cops and bad guys and things like that. It's these two sisters taking on this crazy guy and then the guy who's behind him. And so,
well, you're going to have to read up on adverse possession, which is a real problem. You're lucky that your employer has ties to England, because squatters and the ability to get rid of them has been a huge problem for the British for ages, and especially given all the vacant property in London, or the property, owned by people who don't actually live there. And, and people move in. Sometimes it's a bunch of people, sometimes it's a single person, but it's really hard to get rid of one.
Yeah, and I didn't know that. When I started researching this book, I talked to this one friend of my wife's, and I heard her story. And then I know another guy he owns a lot of rental properties. And I called him up and I said, well, what do you know about the squatter stuff? And he started telling me story after story. And the one that really cracked me up is he had a guy in one of his rental houses in an apartment. And this guy was rich enough. He actually had somebody follow this guy. The guy commits a crime. He gets the guy arrested. He comes out on bail and goes and burns down the apartment building. I mean, he burned like 9 of the units in this apartment building. I mean, he had stories, story after story like that. It was just, in some ways it was hilarious, but but it was, tragic for the property owner.
For the people who lived in them.
And the people who live there, right?
Yeah. But, that's what's interesting, is that there are lots of situations that, are not like the end of the world as we know it. They don't involve, nuclear war or Chinese spies or corrupt politicians or whatever. They're more like the stuff of everyday life. But if you're stuck in one of those, it's more monumental for you. Yeah. I mean, if you're a person, not you're the author. The guy trying to get rid of a squatter is just as desperate as, somebody trying to bribe some, head of some government agency to, buy extra supplies or, stir a contract his way or something.
Well, what struck me about my wife's friend is how helpless she was. There wasn't anything she could do. She went off and hired lawyers, and the lawyers couldn't do anything. They'd call up the police couldn't do anything. And the woman was just utterly helpless. And like I said, in her case, she eventually sold the house because that was the only way she could get out from under this whole, for some reason, the way the law works, at least here in Washington State, is if you sell it, the owner has the right to evict the guy as long as he gives him 3 months notice and does a bunch of other things. But it was, like I say, her helplessness is one of the things that struck me about it. There just wasn't anything she could do. Then I talked to this very rich guy who can afford good lawyers, and he was just as helpless. There wasn't anything he could do. And so that really actually kind of interested me for the book. But,
well, there's a huge controversy going on at the moment here in Phoenix and other places in the country about eviction, and that's, on the one hand, you look at some of these people who are being evicted for non-payment of rent. Basically, they become squatters. And you feel terrible for them. They have terrible stories, hardship, they have children, awful things. But then, you also look at people who are gaming the landlords. And, at some point, the landlord has, a cash problem, a maintenance problem. And there are always people who can take advantage of situations that, I don't know. I mean, it's so interesting. There are always people on the take, there's a whole criminal bent that, whether it's food stamps, for example.
It doesn't matter what it is. People out there committing fraud, no matter what it is, whether
that's
it's
right.
relief money or like the next DeMarco book that's coming out. It was kind of the subplot to the thing was it was people committing Medicaid or Medicare fraud,
Yeah.
which
But that's a big thing.
is a huge. I mean, it's like billions of dollars every year.
And the same thing was true with, COVID relief loans.
Right.
And I mean, there are all kinds of, we had our local newspaper, the Arizona Republic, really went after one of its best reporters, who's a good customer of the store and a good friend, really went after this guy. And it all had to do with restaurant franchise fraud. Can't remember at this point the particulars, but this was a guy who was already a crook and probably, I think, attached to the mafia or some damn thing. But anyway, he was doing it with restaurant franchises, and it was really hard to do anything about him.
Yeah.
So, if you're a writer, you can look all around you and find the stuff of thrillers or crime novels, investigations or whatever, and they don't all have to be on some super level. They can be, on a much lower plane.
Yes, particularly with fraud. I mean, all you have to do is turn on the news. You can find 1,000 examples, like you were talking about earlier. When it comes to politics, there's so many examples that it isn't hard to come up with an idea for a story, really.
No, it sure isn't. In fact, there are way more stories out there than anybody will write. And actually, that's something of a handicap, because there's so many stories out there that are so ridiculous that, I think the challenge for anybody writing fiction today is to write something that is, has not already been eclipsed by the news.
That's true. I feel that way.
Well, let me call Patrick up and see if he has questions or comments from the audience.
Well, I certainly appreciate you having me on. I've enjoyed this.
Oh, it's really our pleasure. And I really love this book. It's a lot of fun to read. If any of you are Grisham fans and, you're looking for your next John Grisham read, this would be it. Right.
Let's see here. Yeah, there are some questions. Let's see. Which writers have influenced you? And here's a good one. And which writers, living or dead, would you like to meet?
Living or dead. I was thinking of the living group. I think I've managed to meet quite a few of them. Like Barbara mentioned, John Sanford. I've always been a huge fan of his, and I had a chance to meet him at the Tucson Book Festival. I'm a big Thomas Perry fan. In fact, I had dinner with him down in Albuquerque. I'm trying to think of other people Michael Connelly I've met, and books I admire, and Robert Cray. I haven't seen a book from him in a while. He's another guy that I admire. And in the dead category, I was trying to think. It'd probably have to be J.D. Salinger, I guess, because I just loved Catcher in the Rye. Maybe like everybody in my generation did. But I don't know if anybody ever got a chance to meet him. So
Rarely.
But he'd be a character worth meeting. I don't know if that answers the question or not, but
yeah, let's see.
There's no right answer, Mike. It's just whatever, whatever you feel has been interesting or influential on you. When you were young, what kind of things did you read?
Oh, I read everything. I was so lucky. My father, who was he worked in a steel mill, but he was a big reader, and and as a result of that, I became a big reader. When I was young, I read the Zane Grey series. I read the Horatio Hornblower series. I read.
They were great.
Yeah, oh, I just love those. I read probably every book that was written about the Civil War. Fictional books that that had characters from the Civil War. But I just read a lot. I was one of those kids that go to the library and you'd get a little star if you read 50 books during the summer or something like that. And then because of my father, my reading test was very eclectic. I mean, I'd went through a science fiction stage, and then I would get and later on I got into John D. McDonnell mysteries. I mean, it was so
you're a reader.
I'm always a reader. Yeah, I'm one of those people. I'm always reading a book. I'm one of those to get to sleep at night. I lay in bed and I read and fall asleep. But every night I'm reading a book. And lately I've been reading more nonfiction, like Michael Lewis's books. I love his books. And but a lot of the nonfiction, sometimes they'll be related to something I'm working on, and sometimes I just want to read about it. But Lewis is one of those authors whose nonfiction I always read.
Let's see here. Just trying to think. Yeah. So how many with house in the title did you do? There were quite a few, weren't there?
There's 15 that have been published, and the 16th one is coming out in 2023.
You have a title for it?
It's called Alligator Alley. We decided to finally get away from the house titles. I was getting tired of those. It was hard coming up with a new one, and finally my publisher and I said, let's change the title on the next one. So it's called Alligator Alley. It'll be the 16th book in that series.
Fantastic. I like the new direction they've gone just with the cover design too. Yeah.
I'm not the least bit artistic. I loved all the covers. I mean, they send me a cover, and I'm sure some writers are different than me, and they'll say, "Oh, I don't like this," or "I don't like this." Almost always when they give me a cover, I'm always kind of impressed with the, with the artist and what he comes up with. And I don't know how much the artist knows about the book, but then some of the covers have been, kind of like the Kay Hamilton series, kind of modern looking covers with designs on them, as opposed to the, and this one is kind of like that. But I've always felt very lucky, and whoever draws the covers, they do an amazing job.
Yeah, no, it's great. Let's see, Mark asks, and he always asks this for some reason, who is publishing your book? Well, it's Atlantic Monthly Press.
Yeah.
And they've done quite a few of them, haven't they? How many?
They've done, except for the first two DeMarcos were published by Doubleday, and then Grove got the rights to all of them. So they've published, let's see, I guess that would be 14 of the DeMarco books. The Kay Hamilton series was published by Penguin. So so Grove has done 14 of those. And they did the Redemption also.
It's Grove Atlantic, for those of you who are wondering.
Yeah.
It's actually, Grove usually comes first, but it was a merger a while back. And so
Yeah.
Grove Atlantic is one company with a very innovative publisher, Morgan and Trinken, who's won lots of awards and done a really interesting job. They're one of the smaller, still functioning publishing companies.
Yeah, he's a very interesting guy. I've been so lucky that they've been, willing to stick with me. And I've always had, like I said, I'm impressed, like with their copy editing. The books will go through 2 or 3 cycles of copy. They still don't catch every typo because I make so many, I guess. But Morgan and the way the company works, and I've just been very fortunate to be with them.
Well, they also published Mark Billingham. They published Don Leon. They've recently been publishing Val McDermott and done a really excellent job. So they have a very
Dion Myers and
Dion Meyer, right? Who we did
another author,
a wonderful conversation with Dion and Michael Conley last week, which you can watch on our Facebook page.
I saw that, and I have to watch that because I really, Dion, I've met him a couple times. He's a great guy, and I like his books also.
Mm-hmm.
There's a I'm sorry. There is a question from Linda. She says, is your lead character based on someone you've met or known?
In Redemption, no. No, it's not based on anybody that I've met or known. It's just, I guess you could say, a composite character in terms of being, what I envision a young stockbroker type would be like, I guess.
Yeah. What about character names for you? Are they? How do you select them, and do they change over time?
That's funny. I mean, most of the character names is just something I just pluck out of the air.
For the sound of it.
Yeah, for the sound of it. That's part of it right there, is for the sound of it. But what's really funny is when I have foreign characters in the books, and I don't know what other authors do, but I will go online to like say the character is Iranian. I go to an Iranian baby naming site to pick out a boy's name. And then I'll go to let's say an Iranian politician site to pick out a last name. And I'll just combine a name that I think I like the sound of with a first name and a last name from an Iranian culture. In one of the books I did that, and the guys, I can't remember the first name now, his last name was Aziz. And I got an email from a guy that says, my name is so-and-so Aziz, and I'm thinking about suing you. Now, he never did, but that was the only time I've ever got a reaction from somebody because of a name I used.
Weird.
Anyway, that's how I get the names. Usually the foreign ones are more interesting. Well, I'll go through and just try to match up a sound I like for a first and a last name. And the American ones is just whatever just occurs to me, I guess. And some of my second book was actually set in the place where I worked. And I actually use the names of several people I work with, and they really got a kick out of that.
As long as they enjoyed it and didn't hate you for it, that's a good thing.
They didn't, unfortunately. I didn't use anyone in the case of a bad character.
Are there any, there's another question. Are there any topics that you would like to write about that you have not written about yet? Any?
Geez, I don't know. I guess
It's a tough question.
The list is probably just endless. You're bombarded these days with the news and with television, and you just get, the ideas just seem like they're just, like one of them lately. And I don't know what I'll do with it. I was intrigued by the scandal over the former president having papers taken from the National Archives. And I was reading about the National Archives, and how they store presidential papers and speeches and things like that. And I just think, there's a book there. I don't know what I'm going to do, but I got this idea of this archivist reads something that comes out of the White House and says, wow, this isn't good. And so I don't know. It's just, like I say, every day you turn on the news, another idea just pops out.
Right. Let's see. Anybody else have questions? No, I think that's about it, Barbara.
Okay. Well, Mike, it's really been a great pleasure to talk to you in some depth today. Thank you very much for joining us. Mike's book was actually published in April. And as I said earlier, we don't always get to what we love in time, but Patrick and I do actually read the books that we discuss. We read the books for our book clubs. And so occasionally we just don't keep up with the moment that they appear. So I thank you for your patience and also for signing books for us. And as Patrick mentioned, we have just a few copies left. And I think it's a wonderful cover. I really like the color and the design. It reminds me a little bit of the Jason Recollect book that we've Hidden Pictures. At least the color does,
Right.
That fabulous red. So anyway, Mike, thanks for your time and thank you all for watching us. And we'll hope to see you again soon. Good night, everybody.
Good night, Barbara. I really enjoyed this.
Good.
Bye.